Imagine this. It wasn't the shimmer of gold or the glitter of silver that fueled medieval England's rise to power, nor was it the exotic spices brought from distant lands. It was something far more ordinary: wool. Across the windswept pastures of Yorkshire, the rolling hills of the Cotswolds, and the green fields of East Anglia, millions of sheep grazed quietly, producing what merchants of the time reverently called white gold. Those soft fibres, seemingly simple, would become the thread that stitched England into Europe's economic fabric. The story begins in the 12th century. England's cool, damp climate, combined with its sweeping meadows, proved to be the perfect breeding ground for sheep. Unlike their continental cousins, English flocks developed a unique long wool, strong, lustrous, and exceptionally well suited for spinning into fine cloth. Weavers across the Channel, from the guilds of Flanders to the workshops of northern Italy, recognised its unmatched quality. What had once been a humble rural byproduct now became the backbone of an economy. Villages, monasteries and lords all expanded their grazing lands, often at the expense of traditional farming. Travellers through the countryside remarked with awe, and sometimes with alarm, that the land seemed devoted more to sheep than to people. This shift wasn't accidental. It mirrored the hunger abroad. Flanders, with its humming workshops in Bruges and Ghent, lived and breathed textiles, yet relied entirely on English wool. Without those bales, looms fell silent. Merchants in Bruges eagerly awaited ships docking from London or Boston, their hulls heavy with fleece. Italian traders from Florence and Lucca soon joined the race, vying for contracts. In Florence itself, the powerful wool guild, Arte della Lana, built its reputation on cloth woven from English fibres. Even the great banking dynasties, the Medici among them, would eventually owe their fortunes to textiles made possible by these exports. For England, this foreign appetite meant steady wealth. Prices climbed, profits soared, and the crown was quick to notice. Taxing wool became one of the most reliable ways to fill royal coffers. Each sack of fleece represented not only commerce, but political leverage. Every bale carried with it invisible threads of influence, tying England's rural meadows to the prosperity of Europe's cities. Yet behind this economic miracle stood a surprising power: the monasteries. Far from being only centres of prayer and contemplation, abbeys became engines of commerce. From the vast Cistercian estates in Yorkshire to Benedictine holdings in the south, monks oversaw immense flocks. Their wool poured into markets in staggering quantities, making them among the wealthiest landholders in the realm. The revenues financed monuments of stone and glass, cathedrals like York Minster and Westminster Abbey, whose grandeur still dominates England's skyline. The faithful who marvelled at soaring arches rarely understood that their splendour was built on the backs of sheep. But wealth concentrated in the hands of churchmen bred resentment. Chroniclers of the day remarked bitterly that, while peasants scraped for bread, monks and bishops grew fat on the proceeds of wool. A caustic saying emerged: "The sheep of England have eaten the men." Still, the monasteries were not idle profiteers. They refined shepherding techniques, managed trade networks, and connected isolated valleys to continental markets. Through wool, they stitched spirituality and commerce into one powerful fabric. Kings, too, saw the possibilities. By Edward I's reign, wool exports had become one of the most heavily taxed goods in the realm. His grandson, Edward III, pushed further. In 1363, he created the wool staple at Calais, a crown-controlled monopoly that forced all continental trade to pass through a single port. Merchants paid duties directly into the royal treasury, ensuring no bale escaped taxation. This system both enriched the crown and cemented England's dominance over Europe's textile industries. Even politics bore the mark of wool. In the House of Lords, the presiding officer still sits upon the wool sack, a cushion stuffed with fleece, a silent tribute to the commodity that underpinned the realm. Yet dependence on wool came at a cost. Disease among flocks, poor harvests of fodder, or disruptions at sea could send revenues plunging. A kingdom that tied its fate so tightly to one commodity risked sharing in its fluctuations. Still, for centuries wool remained the lifeblood of royal finances, underwriting wars, policies and ambitions. The transformation of England's countryside was profound and painful. Sheep brought profits, but also dislocation. Raising flocks required fewer hands than growing grain. Landlords discovered that enclosing open fields into private pastures yielded greater wealth. Villages that once shared common lands suddenly found them fenced off. Wheat, the foundation of bread, dwindled as grain fields gave way to meadows. Peasant families who had tilled strips for generations faced eviction, poverty, and hunger. Chronic hardship bred anger that later erupted in uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Not all were ruined. Some smallholders adapted, keeping modest flocks and selling fleece to supplement meagre incomes. Women spun wool in cottages, weaving themselves into this new economy. But imbalance prevailed. Lords and abbeys grew richer, while common folk bore the brunt of change. Sheep had indeed eaten men, not with teeth, but through the shifting order of land and labour. The wool boom was not confined to fields and monasteries. It reshaped the very flow of European finance. Italian banking houses, the Bardi, Peruzzi, and later the Medici, channeled enormous capital into England's wool. They advanced loans to kings, managed customs, and built intricate networks of credit. To monarchs like Edward III, wool was collateral. During the 100 Years' War, he mortgaged future wool revenues to fund armies in France. Without this credit, fleets and campaigns would have been impossible. The rhythms of shearing in Yorkshire echoed as pulses of finance in Florence. Guilds of exporters coordinated shipments, standardized quality, and guaranteed taxation. Contracts spanned nations, sealed not only with coin but with promises of wool deliveries. In a sense, sheep became silent bankers of Europe. The trade fostered bookkeeping, credit and risk management practices that would lay the foundations of modern banking. What began as fleece on a hillside became a bridge between rural England and the counting houses of Italy. Wool, then, was not merely an agricultural product. It was finance, politics, and faith woven together. It bought swords and armour, raised cathedrals, sustained monasteries, and reshaped entire landscapes. Wool's influence extended deep into the realm of power. Its revenues allowed English monarchs to field professional armies, an extraordinary advantage in an age when most rulers still relied on feudal levies. Horses, armour, mercenaries and provisions were all secured by the proceeds of fleece. During the 100 Years' War, wool taxes became the steady current funding campaigns across France. Without it, Edward III's soldiers would have stood idle. Parliament too recognised wool's importance. Control over subsidies gave the Commons bargaining power with the Crown. Every tax negotiation became an opportunity to demand political concessions. In this way, wool quietly nurtured parliamentary authority, nudging England toward a more representative form of governance. Sheep did not just finance war, they shaped politics, but dependence bred risk. A failed shearing, a disrupted trade route, or a slump in demand could unravel royal finances overnight. Rivals exploited these vulnerabilities, yet for generations the fleece remained the foundation on which kings built ambitions and realms. England's uniqueness in Europe was stark. Italy boasted brilliant artisanship, Flanders mastered weaving, yet both relied on England for the raw material. This created an unusual balance of power. England, often seen as peripheral, suddenly held leverage. By restricting exports, kings could punish enemies or pressure allies. In times of tension, the wool trade itself became a diplomatic weapon. No other European nation enjoyed such a position, where pastures translated so directly into politics. By the 15th century, however, the story began to shift. England moved from being merely a supplier of raw wool to becoming a producer of cloth itself. Instead of shipping bales abroad, merchants invested in domestic weaving. Towns like Norwich, Coventry, and later Leeds blossomed into centres of textile production. The putting out system connected rural households to spinning and weaving work, allowing families to earn supplemental income. For many, this was a lifeline in a world where access to land was shrinking. This transition was gradual but revolutionary. England no longer sent its wealth across the Channel. It added value within its borders, keeping profits at home. Dyers, fullers and weavers refined techniques, producing fabrics that rivaled the luxuries of Florence and Bruges. A skilled labour force emerged, one that centuries later would power the Industrial Revolution. The journey from white gold to woven cloth marked England's path from pastoral wealth toward industrial might. Yet behind the numbers and exports lay human lives. For kings, wool was a weapon of finance. For abbots, it was the scaffolding of cathedrals. For merchants, it was a passport into banking networks and political influence. But for countless peasants, wool meant eviction, hunger, and the loss of ancestral ties to the land. Prosperity for some came at the expense of many. The very cathedrals funded by wool revenues rose while villages nearby lay abandoned. The victories of English armies were celebrated even as rural families wandered in search of work. The grandeur of towers and the silence of deserted fields existed side by side, both legacies of white gold. Still, wool stitched England into a broader European fabric. From shepherds in the Cotswolds to bankers in Florence, from abbots in Yorkshire to weavers in Bruges, a single commodity bound together economies and lives. It was more than a trade. It was a network of human destinies woven across borders. By the late medieval period, England stood transformed. The wealth of sheep had lifted it from a peripheral island into a central player on the European stage. Its fleece financed wars, built monuments, reshaped fields, enriched merchants, and destabilized villages. The story of wool was both triumph and tragedy, prosperity and loss. And so, the tale of England's white gold leaves us with a reminder: prosperity always carries a price. The soft fibres that enriched a kingdom also frayed the bonds of rural life. Yet from those same threads, England spun its future. Proof that even the humblest of materials, the fleece of a sheep, can change the fate of empires.